Tom McIntyre lives near me, relatively, in Harvard, Massachusetts, and we've been friends for many years. We've heard each other's lectures time and again. I don't think we have dueling lectures, but we sit and enjoy each other's lectures at Chapter 8 meetings and other venues where we both seem to like to hear ourselves talk, and unbelievably people like to listen to us too. So it's wonderful that we share a passion both for studying and researching horology, but then sharing what we've known. And Tom certainly is well known for many years for being both a great scholar and researcher, but a sharer as well. So it's when we talked about who he might want to speak about at this event, there was no hesitation that Paul Chamberlain was the one that he wanted to speak about. And like all of these people, I've heard their names, I know a little bit about it, but I'm learning how much I didn't know about these people and how important it is that we're honoring and learning about them today. So, Tom McIntyre.
When I was looking at the back of the program and that long list of collectors, one of the names that popped up at me was my friend Bradley Ross, who went to these meetings with me for many years and is now, since he had the good fortune of dying, become one of the collectors. Because this is only about dead people that we're talking today. And then to borrow a note from Jonathan, one of Brad's projects that he pursued for several years, he loved A.P. Walsh, the famous chronometer and maker of London. And he had a lady's watch by A.P. Walsh that he wanted to have cased as a wristwatch. But Brad, although it's nice to call him a collector, was really an accumulator. And so his house was just piled with these things as high as they could be. And they were all sold at auction, and I bought the movement at his estate sale. And then I had a friend in Germany case it for me, so I've now fulfilled the wish for Brad, and I'm very proud of having done that. Okay. Let's see what's the best way to do this. Let's use the arrow slides for now. Oh, sorry, before I do that, there's one trick that I have to do. Yes. I need that arrow to do my presentation. And it's hard to get it to go from here to there because it's magic. So, now let me go back to the first slide. Paul Chamberlain was born February 28, 1865, during the war between the states in America. And he died on May 27, 1940. Just before the Second World War began by a few years, and just before the NAWCC came into existence a couple of years later. And just a little background about who he was. The Chamberlain family migrated from New Hampshire west to Scipio, Ohio in the early 19th century. And from there they moved to Three Oaks, Berrien County, Michigan in 1843. They actually founded the town of Three Oaks, so they were the original settlers there. And Paul was born, as I said, in February 28, 1865. His father, Henry, in addition to being a significant landowner, was state representative in Lansing, Michigan from 1848 to 1855. And he later served on the Michigan State Board of Agriculture, which governed Michigan Agricultural College, which is now Michigan State University. So that's the connection to Michigan State is from that association. Oh, that doesn't work on this one. Oh well. I think I have this memorized, but I have notes here that are no longer just, never mind. Can I do that?
Do you need Nick?
No, I don't think I need Nick. I think I just better wing it without Nick. He attended the college in Three Oaks, Michigan, and then he went to Massachusetts to prep school. And his his uncle, who was originally Moses Chamberlain, but changed his name to Melon Chamberlain for some reason unknown, was a prominent lawyer in the Boston area and was one of the early people who managed the Boston Public Library. So since we're in this great collection of libraries here, I just wanted to mention that the Chamberlain's uncle was a famous librarian in Boston, as well as being a major legal practice in the Boston area. From there, he came back to Ohio for his college work, and then went on to Michigan State University to get his Bachelor of Science degree. And from there, he went to Cornell for his graduate studies and got a Master of Science from Cornell in the 1880, I guess, 1891. Anyway, and shortly after that, he moved to Chicago and was a professor at Lewis Academy, which later became the Illinois Institute of Technology, and he established a structural engineering practice there. And I got this little bit of the 1900 census up here because I think it's very interesting. This is not a touch screen, that's why I can't do that. And that's wrong too, because that goes through the slides. In 1917, the United States entered the First World War, and Chamberlain joined the Army at that time and was responsible for wartime production in the Midwest. As Rupert Gould says, the French 75 millimeter field weapons, which some people told me about when I finally picked up this piece of information, I was informed that that was in fact the secret weapon on the Allied side in the First World War. These were the recoilless cannons that could be fired 3 rounds a minute instead of a round every 4 or 5 minutes. And so they made a significant difference in the process of the war. How the collecting began. He bought his first watch in 1913 at the age of 48. And by August 1914, he'd accumulated 80 items and put them on display at the National Retail Jewelers Association meeting in Chicago. Please don't try to read the broadside, but the broadside is the catalog of that collection for that event. And you can find it online at the Internet Archive or any number of places. It's a well-known document. He published an additional set of articles, 38 from 1915 to 1917. And at the beginning of the war, when we went into the war and he joined, he donated his collection to the museum that his family had established in Three Oaks, Michigan. And so that collection was the first Chamberlain collection. And a lot of people get confused when you talk about the Chamberlain collection, because that one's had a lot more publicity than the real collection. The real collection is some 1,300 items that never saw the light of day except privately when he had visited friends or had friends visiting him. And his wife Olivia had died in 1920, just after the war was over, and his children had all decided that they were grown up and needed to go on and build lives of their own. So he was left there alone in Chicago. His engineering practice had disappeared because he'd neglected it for 4 years. And he ended up moving to Newark, New Jersey, just across the river here, and took up his life there. In 1921, they had an exhibit at the Art Institute of Chicago of the watches that were at the Chamberlain Museum in Three Oaks, Michigan. And he spent that year building this catalog and putting it together. And that's standard publication that's relatively readily available. A year after he'd done that, in 1955, the Chamberlain Museum had been transferred to Michigan State University in Lansing, and it was discovered that some of the watches in the collection had been stolen, and the theft was widely publicized to help recover the missing items. And 4 of the watches were recovered. The Donald J. Mozart watch, which is a very rare American watch, was one of them. And another one was Chamberlain's Mudge cylinder with repeating works that was recovered but not by the university. It showed up at an auction house, and they settled that dispute by letting the auction house sell it and give the money to the university instead of to the consignor. Because after all, it was stolen property. One of the interesting anecdotes of this particular theft event is the university published a list of the pieces that were stolen, and among them is a McIntyre watch, which is of special interest to me. And the McIntyre watch had in fact been lent to that exhibit by the people who owned it in Chicago. It was not part of the Chamberlain collection, but it was included in the exhibit at the Art Institute of Chicago just because it was available. And in fact, that watch ended up being in the Time Museum while the Time Museum was alive, along with another McIntyre watch. And it was finally sold at the Sotheby's sale, and the Helene Museum in Chicago purchased that one and has it on display in their collection. So, just touting the family watches. And then in 2009, when we had the NAWCC meeting in Grand Rapids, Michigan, the watches from the Chamberlain Collection were brought out. The Chamberlain Collection at Michigan State were put on display, and they did this nice little catalog, and they actually had 44 watches from the 300 nominal that were in the collection at Michigan State. And these are sort of the top 44 that were put out for a display for that meeting. And the photographs for this little booklet, which is available from the NAWCC as a catalog, were made for the exhibit by Dennis Ingalls, and the whole thing was put together by Terry Casey, who was one of our early editors at the NAWCC. So, an important figure in the NAWCC as well. Just wanted to point out that Chamberlain collected all sorts of things, but they were all about horology. And he made a point of collecting stories and images of all the famous watchmakers, everybody who he felt was important in the development of timekeeping. And it's not really complete, but it's a whole section of his book, It's About Time, is devoted to these. And there's 3 chapters for the 3 centuries of watch collecting, and then there's a large number of photographs. There's a picture of each of the people, and then the story of their life there in the back of the book. And those go all the way from Christian Huygens to Charles DeLong, who was also a friend of his. And then Chamberlain developed strong relationships with other collectors, leading watchmakers and horological professionals. Several watchmaker friends are included in the part 3 of It's About Time with the biographies. There are also people that I don't show on the screen, like Barclay Stevens and Oscar T. Lang, who had interests that overlapped his own, and Courtney Gilbert, and other European collectors who admired the energy of his collecting. Barclay Stevens, Oscar Lang, Carl Vogel, and many more who visited his home in the mountains in the Adirondacks that they called Hurry Up in King, New Hampshire. I think this is one of Chamberlain's watches in the sense that he considered items to be in his collection. He had a chance to take this watch apart, dimension drawings, all the components of it, and study it, and essentially own it intellectually. And this is the picture he made of it at Windsor Castle that he published on the subject. And since Jonathan does a wonderful job of explaining why it was 9 years before, since he found out about this watch, before he actually had a chance to take a picture of it, that's another story, and I'll leave that out of this presentation today. But you really should read that. It brings up some interesting contrasts between the culture, at least at that time in England and in America, because no Englishman could have gotten access to Windsor and taken that watch apart on the table in the display area and made pictures of the components and measured everything. But an American who didn't know any better could easily come in and do that if he knew the right people. And Rupert Gould was one of his entry points to that access, but the American Embassy was also one of them. And he had some reputation that he was carrying forward because of his work during the war as well. This is Chamberlain's clock collection. Not very impressive, but they are nice pieces. The little bird cage up on the left corner is one of those blacksmith clocks that were made entirely by people pounding on them with a hammer and putting them together without any screws or any other fixtures. So this is a very early one. Probably, I think he said that he thought it was 1560 or something like that. I don't know whether that's appropriate or not. There are also 3 Japanese clocks in this display that you can see there in the middle of the wall. And his Rengo Ori clock, as well as a very interesting regulator by the Howard Clock Company that had some special assistance to improve the timekeeping. Charles Fazold, who is another famous watchmaker in America, had entered an exhibit for the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. And that exhibit that clock was eventually purchased by Chamberlain. And in his house up in the Adirondacks, he had it mounted so that it drove a dial in the ceiling of the room that this picture is a picture of the wall of, and provided lighting to that room. And it also drove a dial on the front porch that showed the time to people arriving at the house. And a very nice piece indeed. So that's his clock collection. This, I think, was his favorite watch. It's a sunrise sunset watch that was made by Delachaux. And there are lots of watches that manage the difference between real time, solar time, and our calculated time. But this one has the interesting property that, let's see, I can use this. Right here and right here are 2 shutters, and there's a cam that controls them, and every day they move in or out to show the correct time for sunrise at this point and sunset at this point. And then the little star piece here, gold, moves across and shows the time of day during the daylight hours. And at the end of the daylight hours, of course, it's hidden behind the side. And then the wheel that's driving it has some missing teeth, and when they get to the position where the gear would engage with them, the hand flies back to the other side and is now prepared to go the next day. So sometime in the dark at night, that hand moves back to the front. So the only thing that's really interesting about it is the fact that it actually does get an analog display of sunrise and sunset. Chamberlain thought that was the only watch that actually did that. There are clocks that do that. There's three or not a lot, but there's some clocks that do that. But that's the only watch. And another thing about this watch was he had seen this in a collection in Europe. And he was really interested in it, but he never did get a chance to talk to the owner. And then years later, he heard that it was in New York in somebody else's collection. And he had a friend, Carl Pluckla, who was a prominent watch dealer in New York. And he approached Carl and he said, "Carl, if that watch ever shows up, would you buy it for me?" And sure enough, a couple of years later on his birthday, Carl Pluckla showed up with the watch. And he was delighted by that. And that one and the Rango clock are the only two pieces in his collection that he ever actually placed an open order for like that. In general, he just bought whatever he could find that suited the notion he had in his mind. But there were some pieces that were important to him just because they fascinated him. Just to fill that out and prep a little bit for a later slide. Barclay Stevens was a very close friend to Chamberlain. They met as fellow collectors. And Stevens died February 28th, 1962. And the double shelf Sunrise Sunset watch was sent to A.E. Ogden in Los Angeles for restoration because it needed a little bit of work after Chamberlain bought it. And Stevens made the photographs of the watch and when that story was published in Horology. And Chamberlain also asked him to write the introduction to his book, It's About Time. So a significant part of the Chamberlain collection, it turns out, joined the Stevens collection at the California Academy of Science after Chamberlain's death. And the real trick here is to try to figure out what happened to Chamberlain's collection, because nobody really knows for sure where all these watches went. The California Academy of Sciences in the 1990s decided they didn't have room for horology anymore because there was just way too much science for the space they had available. And so they loaned those items to the NAWCC at that time, and then about 2013, they actually deeded over the collection to the NAWCC. And so now that collection of Barclay Stevens belongs to the NAWCC. And going on. So, here's the Rango clock, which is the other clock that he had placed an open order for. He believed that this one had belonged to the colonial governor, the French colonial governor of New Orleans, and that's in fact where the clock was purchased. He'd first seen one of these at the Soames Museum in London, and had found it, just incredibly interesting and wanted one. And this is the other item that he actually placed an open order for. So talking about the disposition of all these pieces, Chamberlain's Rango clock was sold to W.H. Smith of Waltham. W.H. Smith was a manufacturer of pumps, mills, and other machinery, and they were actually the foundry for Fred McIntyre's Zenith pumps that were one of the key components of the success of the synthetic fiber industry, the ability to pump very, very sticky stuff at high temperatures and have it work efficiently and continuously. But he also was a collector, and so Smith, if you see here, has this. He was a collector and a craftsman, I guess. This thing he's sitting on here is a little steam locomotive that he built himself. It's a scale steam locomotive, and it was called Ella Cinders, and it's running in his backyard in his house in Waltham in that picture. So he collected lots of stuff. And Margaret Chamberlain lists Smiths as benefactors in the book It's About Time, in the foreword to the book. So notes them as people who were important to her in dealing with the situation she had at hand. W.H. Smith himself never did join the NAWCC, but his son Arthur did join the NAWCC in January 1st of 1944. In any case, when Smith died, the Rango clock was donated to the American Clock and Watch Museum, and it was there for many years, but it didn't really fit the cultural setting for the American Clock and Watch Museum, and the board of directors voted to deaccession it quite a few years ago, and then finally it was sold just recently for $155,000. So that's where the Rango, I don't know who it was sold to, so maybe the person who bought it is here in the audience.
It went to a collector in the Midwest.
In the Midwest, yes. And he's not here in the audience?
No, I think so. The product 180,000 with the buyer's agreement.
Okay. Yes, the gentleman in the back is the one who knocked it down. Yes. And additionally on the wall in that first picture of his clock collection were the Japanese clocks. And these clocks are in the NAWCC collection with an accession number that denotes that they came from Barclay Stevens. And I have a strong suspicion that these watches are from, that these pieces are from Chamberlain's collection also. But it's going to be very difficult to establish it for these kind of clocks because there are no real identifying marks on them. So pictures may not do the job on that, but there at least a little bit of additional evidence. Here's another one that Jonathan is a little bit involved with since he did the curation of this collection for the Mariners Museum. A note in the November 1940 Horology Journal describes the chronometers donated to the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia. There are 8 historic chronometers and 22 balances, which are just listed here. And if you're familiar with them, you know what they are. And the balances would take way too long to read. But I did put up 2 pictures, and the most obvious one. Did you make this picture?
Could
of
be.
The older. I think perhaps you took this picture. I think Jonathan took this picture of the older. I'm not sure. It's on their website, and it looked a little bit better in terms of technical detail than some of the other pictures on the website. In any case, this is the older chronometer, and it's probably the most elaborate standard chronometer that anyone ever built, and way more elaborate than there's any sense in it being, but it did perform well, and so that's the reason that it's in the collection. Anyway, it's a fine piece. The other one that I took pictures from to show here is the 2-day motel, and the reason that's there is because Chamberlain said that was his favorite chronometer. So the 2-day motel was his favorite chronometer, and it had been found for him by Leroy in Paris. So that when he asked for a nice French chronometer, that was the one they came up with. The museum also has a pair of chronometers that were donated in 1937 by Chamberlain. One of those is a John Roger Arnold, and the other one is a Mateel. And the John Roger Arnold is listed in their catalog as unknown source. I've had some John Roger Arnold, so I knew by looking at the movement that it was a J.R. Arnold chronometer. But that's the other pieces that are there of that general class. To finish that story, yes. The collection was to be donated originally to the Mariners Museum. But Margaret, when she found out what the collection was worth, started to back out of the deal. And another collector was found that actually donated the money to buy the collection for Margaret and give it to the Mariners Museum is how they actually ended up with the collection. I don't know who that third party is, but there is a third party that's mentioned in the discussion. Okay, this is examples of pieces. Let's see. Oops. Why is it doing that to me? Go back. There we go. Okay, these are pieces that are in the NAWCC collection. And the reason I found out that they were there was this, let's see, where is it? Okay, this piece. This is the hog's bristle regulator that actually is a pretty famous artifact. It turns out that nobody knows about it, but it's a very famous artifact. And as I started reading back through the literature, I found a dozen references to it over the last 80 or 100 years. So it's a well-known piece. And when Rory McAvoy came to be the executive director for the NAWCC, they were looking at some of the interesting pieces, and he saw that one and thought it was incredibly fascinating, and took some nice new pictures of it and posted them on Instagram. And I saw the pictures on Instagram, and I said, oh, I think I've seen that watch someplace else before too. And sure enough, that provided essentially the Rosetta Stone to connect the Chamberlain archives back through the Barclay Stevens archives to those pieces that are in the NAWCC Museum. And so that was the watch that made the connection between what we actually have in our collection and the pieces that belong to Chamberlain. Let's go over here. This is one of the earliest ones. And I'm not sure, but that one has a number on its collection notice that looks like it may have belonged to Gilbert at one time as well. And somebody remarked about the American watches, the Waterbury watches in the Gilbert collection. And Gilbert and Chamberlain were remarking that Gilbert was interested in some American watches, but the way he got them was to send a couple of pieces to Chamberlain and ask him to replace them, to send back watches from America that were also interesting. So this watch was probably exchanged from Gilbert's collection for some of those Waterbury long lines that showed up in the Gilbert collection. And it had been a fair trade. The Waterburys were commuting watches, and this is just a movement. In any case, let's no, that didn't do what I wanted it to do. So this setup didn't work quite as well as I had hoped. Yeah, there we go. Okay, each of those watches that is in that display has several images available. So this is the French fluted steel watch that he dated around 1640. And notice the 27-122 there, that's an accession number, and B27 is a code that identifies everything that I think came from the Chamberlain collection through Barclay Stevens. So we can go back and dig through the archives in Columbia, Pennsylvania, and find those things. This is the hog's bristle. This is Thomas Bullock of Bath. Chamberlain was friends with a collector in Bath and spent some time out there. And this particular one struck me as particularly interesting anyway, because it appears to have an original watch paper in it with the same name as the maker and of an appropriate age to maybe be the middle 1760s. I don't know any other watch paper that and I certainly can't identify that as being such a thing, but that may be a genuine 1760s watch paper in the back of a watch. And I suspect Chamberlain had some reason for owning And then this is an Albert Potter chronometer 103. And it was patented in October 1875. This was another one of the pieces in the Chamberlain collection. The point of these is that they're just loose artifacts. And so in a normal auction, you wouldn't expect them to sell for very much. They're, even though they're rather nice. And this is another set that are even a step down from that. These are watches that are in the so-called Chamberlain cases that were actually made by Henry Jr. For the most part. Chamberlain probably made some of them himself by hand. But they're identified, these watches are all identified in the papers that Margaret left with a Chamberlain number on them. So for instance, the Parkinson and Francillon there has number 531 in the Chamberlain, and it matches, that entry in the Chamberlain records matches the serial number on that watch. The three there on the, not a touch screen. The three there on the left, on the right are all my property. This one belongs to a friend, and I thought I would, it's a particularly nice example of a Brigade Ruby cylinder, repeating watch. And it was discussed by Chamberlain as being incomplete. That is, it's an incomplete movement. And the reason it was an incomplete movement was missing some pivots. Oh dear. Yeah, it's missing some pivots. And had to have just some finishing work done to actually put it in running order. And I know that Margaret sold this watch to John Minor, who was a friend of Charles DeLong's, who worked with him at Illinois and lived in Denver at the time that this was all happening. And so she apparently sold a number of watches from the Chamberlain Collection to John Minor. So that's another place that some of them went. And they're showing up in the Midwest, or in the Rocky Mountains area now. Getting to the book itself, this is Chamberlain and Print, and Chamberlain wrote articles for the journal Horology for quite a few years. He started writing his articles in March 1915 in American Jeweler, and the total articles he wrote that I have records of were 175, although I learned today that there's a collection of lecture manuscripts that exist in the British Museum as well that I'd love to go see sometime. I did not know they were there. Horology was published for 7 years while Chamberlain was at the peak of his writing. And he actually published some more personal articles about his collecting there. He was also listed as on the masthead as one of the publishers, or one of the. Sorry, I'm missing my notes here, so it's causing me a little. Anyway, this magazine was continued after the merger of the American Horologist with the Orville Hagen's magazine, Horology, American Horologist and Horology merged together to form a single magazine. Right after this one finished publication. And I'd actually not had a chance to see the full set of them until I looked at Fortunat's set in the library upstairs yesterday, because I didn't have volume 1 of that set. Okay. Now just a little fun for the Horological Society of New York. John Louis Aurora was a friend and traveling companion for Paul Chamberlain. And he was also the editor of the watch section of the National Watchmaker section of the National Jeweler. And so he published articles in that, And one of them that is particularly nice if you want to know how watches were made in Switzerland is this one called the Cabinetier, which talks about the social life as well as the functional life of watchmakers in Geneva. But John Lloyd was also one of the early officers, one of the early presidents of the Horological Society of New York. And this picture of him over here shows him at the time he had that role as well. He also wrote a memorial to Chamberlain in the book It's About Time, where he talks about having gone with him to Switzerland and going to Geneva, and Chamberlain knew more of his family's friends in Geneva than he did. And he was struck by the fact that Chamberlain had made so many friends in the community there. And he also mentions that they were there to gather these pieces for the Ford Museum in Michigan, and Chamberlain had agreed to help him with that. The little book up here at the top is sort of an interesting artifact. John Lloyd Rourke is a watchmaker, but since he was writing these articles, and he had piles of these articles, he thought it would be interesting to learn how to do some bookbinding. And so he actually made bookbindings for these little collections of articles himself, and then gave them to worthy friends. And Urban Thielman was one of the fairly early, but not as early as the very beginning of the NAWCC. And so his membership number was not low enough to be a member of the Old Timers chapter until the date of this gift from Roy, which welcomed him into membership of the Old Timers chapter of the NAWCC, which is the lowest 200 numbers of the membership. Pardon? You think I should? Okay. Quickly. I just wanted to show you this lovely young lady is Zelda McIntyre. She's Fred McIntyre's daughter. And when she was 10 years old, Chamberlain had been working on the violin and wanted to learn how to play the violin, and he decided it wasn't going to work for him and had given it up. And he gave her his violin. And then there was a nice letter from him to her about how well she was doing on the violin and so forth. And then later, when he and John Louis were in Switzerland, she had sent him a billfold for the New Year's present, and he was writing back this letter, but he included in there his story of how the old tools and so forth that Rourke had asked him to help him with ended up being his problem to get back to the United States. So just a little bit of friendly going on. Okay. Rupert Gould wrote a memorial, or an appreciation to, it wasn't a memorial at this time, to Major Chamberlain in mid-1930s, December 1935 issue. And it was talking about how Chamberlain had been ill from all of his heavy traveling and work putting together his collection. And his friends had become concerned about his health. But then his health seemed to have improved. And the reason his health had improved is that he'd found this lady, Margaret Chamberlain, and had married her. So, and this is, Margaret Chamberlain is a bit of a mystery in all this, except that because of the census records, I know that she was living in Bed-Stuy across the river when she was very young, and she lived about 4 blocks from here, going west in 1910, and in 1920 her family had moved up to Riverside Park. So anyway, Margaret's a girl from this neighborhood, and she and Chamberlain got married in 1935. Just another note about her. The only other thing I could find about her was this passport application where she was going on a trip with a lady as her governess in 1919. It's okay.
I'll do last slide, Tom, or make it last.
I can try.
Okay.
Okay. This slide shows basically the delayed honeymoon of Paul Chamberlain and Margaret. He mentions that on Friday, October 25th, 1935, they sailed to England on the American farm. And then on 10 days later, they arrived in London. He tells a story about the pilot jumping up on the rope to climb into the boat, take them into dock. And that was Margaret's first trip to Europe. And they stayed at Courtney Gilbert's house on this trip while they were in London. And he talks a lot about going through the collections at Courtney's house and how incredible it was to have so many Tompkins and Grahams and Ludges all together in one place and trying to just sort your mind out about how it all worked in terms of what the importance of each of these items was. From there, they went on to Paris. It's stuck.
ROP.
No, because it's got a pop-up window, and I can't get the pop-up window to go away. Thank you. Yes, that RP still works here, doesn't it? Okay, and so they traveled to London, and he recites all the friends they visited there in London, including going to the casemaker's shop and showing his wife how incompetent he was on a pole and so forth, and visiting all the old friends. And then going on to France, where he sent another letter from Paris describing what it had been like at Gilbert's house the preceding week. And then finally going on to Vienna, Switzerland, and Geneva for a week and spending some time there. And then finally coming back and spending a few days in Paris and returning on January 10th to America by way of the American trade. Los Angeles, Chamberlain's birthday, the Kirkridge Dow Company gave him a special membership card. This is the Chamberlains with Friends up in the mountains at Hurry Up. And this is the creation of About Time, noting that Margaret's collection files were donated to the NAWCC in December of 1944. And this is a listing of all the people that Chamberlain lists as having been important to him. I think there were many more than this, but these are the ones that made it into the documents. And then, just to note, Margaret Chamberlain actually did move to California later, into Redlands, California, or San Bernardino, and that was her mailing address for the NAWCC. She died in '79. So where's the collection now? Well, I think the clues are that some of it is in the NAWCC. Some of it is distributed among various collectors in the forms of these small watches, in the so-called Chamberlain cases, which is found out about the Rango and its sale. But Margaret Chamberlain probably gave or sold a lot more things to the Smiths than just the Rango clock. And the Smiths gave most of their things to not only, they gave a lot of things to the American Clock and Watch Museum, but they also gave a bunch of things to the Waltham Museum of Science and Industry, which is basically a black hole. Nobody's ever curated that collection or looked through it or done anything with it. It's just rooms with stuff in them. So it would be a worthwhile project for somebody to try to go down there and see what's going on. And, okay, I think we'll let it go at that.